Hey, APUSH gang. Hope you guys are having a good weekend. I am going to record Monday's lesson, and you will notice that I have a prop today. This prop is a copy of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And I'm actually not sure what else. Let me see if it's got anything else on there. Yep, it's just the two of those. I'm actually going to get you guys a copy, a little booklet of each of these. I may have enough for the class. I'll have to go look at my stash at school. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the Bill of Rights, which is not in this, I don't think. Hold that thought. Let me see. Ah, it is. So the Bill of Rights is included in my little stash here. And so are the other 17 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. So I'm just going to stick that right there. So John Adams, as you can see, has gone back to his proper place on the wall in my hallway. So we are going to talk a little bit about the Bill of Rights today. The last time when we visited via video, we were talking about Chapter 7, and I think we had entered the conversation about the Federalist Papers and getting the Constitution across the finish line. And then I went on to some other things, and I realized after the fact that I forgot to circle back around and talk about the importance or the significance of the Bill of Rights as it was discussed in Chapter 7 and the importance of it in the ratification process of the U.S. Constitution. So I'm going to do a real quick review on that and then press on. But the Bill of Rights was probably one of those compromises that helped get the Constitution across the finish line, especially in Virginia and New York and some of the New England states. Most of the state constitutions at that point had a Bill of Rights. They were all a little bit different. And so there were many anti-federalists, such as Patrick Henry and others, that were super concerned that the federal constitution, which was about to become the supreme law of the land, did not have a Bill of Rights included in it. In fact, some people thought it was absolutely horrifying that James Madison and his bunch of Federalists would even consider adopting a constitution that did not have a federal Bill of Rights. And so after much back and forth and cajoling and fighting and Federalist Papers and back and forth, James Madison and the Federalists concluded that they needed to offer a Bill of Rights as one of the first acts of the new Congress in order to get this Constitution across the finish line. So unlike other politicians, the Federalists were true to their word. Once the Constitution was ratified and the first Congress, Congress number 1, was sworn into office, they did indeed introduce a Bill of Rights in the first Congress. The Bill of Rights actually contained 12 amendments, not 10, but only 10 of them made it across the finish line. I think it was the first one that Madison wrote, it was either the first or second, said that Congress could not vote for a pay raise that went into effect when they were serving in Congress. So if Congress gave itself a pay raise, it would have to go into effect in the next Congress. So basically it prevented them from giving themselves raises. That particular amendment and the Second Amendment did not make it across the finish line. Only 10 of the 12 amendments were ratified. When you guys go to Washington, D.C., hopefully in the spring, I'm still hopeful that that's going to happen, you will see the Bill of Rights on display. The Declaration of Independence is to the left of the Constitution. The Constitution is in the middle of that room in the National Archives, and then the Bill of Rights is to the right. And the Bill of Rights that is on display is the actual parchment that Madison presented to Congress with all 12 amendments. And so if you go and look for the First Amendment, the right to practice religion, speech, press, all of that, it's actually, I think, number 3 on that list, since the first 2 were not ratified. Interesting, the last amendment to the U.S. Constitution now, the 27th Amendment, was ratified, I think, in the 1990s, is almost identical to Madison's language about preventing Congress from giving itself raises. So eventually, that amendment was ratified. It just took 200 and some odd years for it to be ratified. So anyway, so the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution were ratified by the states during the first Congress, and thus fulfilling the promise, another compromise that helped to get the Constitution ratified eventually in all 13 states. There was part of the reason they wanted a federal Bill of Rights is because of states' rights and always a pushback against federal power. There was a concern that these universal rights might be applied differently in different states. And what happens if you have a case that just goes to state court? Are the principles and the civil rights that are listed in the U.S. Federal Bill of Rights not going to be applied in a state case? And actually that was the case until probably 100 years later. So anyway, that's what got across the finish line. You will notice that there is a copy of the Bill of Rights, a summary of the Bill of Rights on the third PowerPoint slide. And put my glasses on so I can read it. I also uploaded a Word document to Google Classroom, and I think it's important for you to print that out and have that, put that in your notebook. I can make copies of it when you guys get back if you don't have access to a printer. But real quickly, the First Amendment, I call them freedoms of expression, for the freedom of religion, the freedom of speech, the freedom of the press, the freedom to assemble, and the right to petition your government. Those are all ways that we express ourselves in a free society. Right now in our country, we're having a debate about that because a lot of our social media platforms are trying to censor speech. They're trying to determine what people can and cannot say. And so in their attempt to prevent false claims being made on their social media platforms, they are determining what is false and what is true, and they're kind of creating their own narrative. So Twitter's been doing that, Google's been doing that, Facebook has been doing that, Instagram has been doing that. I keep getting these little messages when I read a story, or sometimes if I post something about election fraud or something, I keep getting these messages that say the projected winner is, or this. I don't know that I've gotten a message that says this contains fraudulent information, because I try not to post anything that might be fraudulent that can't be proved. But definitely big tech is certainly censoring us and thereby censoring our free speech. They think they have the right to do that because they own the platform. But because of the new nature of social media, those platforms are under different regulations than most communication systems. And so I suspect down the road, depending on Congress, there will be some regulation of some of those social media platforms. But anyway, what I'd like for you to do is to peruse these first 10 amendments. We're familiar with the first one, the second one, the right to bear arms. The third, protection against housing soldiers or quartering soldiers in homes, civilian homes. The Fourth Amendment, protection against unreasonable search and seizure, protection against the issuance of warrants without probable cause. The Fifth Amendment is the right to a trial, protection against trial without indictment, double jeopardy, self-incrimination, that your property can't be seized. And the Sixth Amendment, the right to a speedy trial, the right to be informed of what you have been charged with, the right to be confront your witnesses, so people can't anonymously take you to court, the right to call witnesses on your behalf. You have a right to legal counsel, and if you can't afford counsel, a lawyer will be provided for you. Anyway, you look through those, and in your Google Doc, it's going to ask you to select a couple of these civil liberties that are enshrined in the Bill of Rights and decide which of the ones, at least that I have noted here, other than the First Amendment, so the Second Amendment through the 10th Amendment, and tell me why. I want you to pick two of the most important civil liberties or civil rights that are protected under the Bill of Rights, and tell me why you think those are two of the most important ones that we have been given under the Constitution. So okay, moving on. The next few pages in Chapter 7, basically the back 40 of the Chapter 7 deals with, okay, We have a new Constitution. We have a new identity. We are now the United States of America under this unified Constitution. We now have a system of federalism where we have a federal government and state governments. Who are the people? We, the people of the United States. Who are the people? And so the next few pages of the last part of chapter 7 deal with our national identity. What is an American? What does that mean? And so the author of your book, Eric Foner, brought to our attention the fact that the Constitution is considered a secular document. It avoids a whole lot of spiritual words and adjectives. So it's considered a secular document. Of course, the people that wrote it were very religious, but it does not use the word God in it. And it talks about 3 groups of people. It even avoids using the word slavery because it would be offensive to some, and it would also prop up slaveholders, and so they avoid the use of the word slavery. So there's 3 different people groups that are identified in the Constitution. The Indians are noted in large part because they are dealt with as separate, sort of like separate empires or their own grouping with Native people group. And so because the U.S. government signed treaties with these Indian tribes and Indian nations, they have a specific identity as the Native peoples or Indians. Then there's an expression of others in the Constitution, and usually when they're talking about others, other people, they're usually referring to servants, indentured servitude, might be referring to loosely apprentices who sort of indentured themselves to the people that were training them. Predominantly is speaking of slaves. So you have your Native Americans are one group of people. Your slaves, indentured servants, apprentices, or whatever is your other group of people, and then the people, which is us. And so he also talks about the fact that in most of Europe, people were either identified ethnically. Like, I am German, I am Scottish, I am Welsh, I am Russian, I am Italian, I am Serb, I'm Turkish. But in America, we are a confluence of a whole bunch of different backgrounds. And so, now primarily Anglo-Saxon, but not necessarily. And so, and also Europe divided itself amongst the term he uses is civic nationalism. So there's civic nationalism and there's ethnic nationalism. We sort of intuitively understand ethnic nationalism. I am a proud German. I am a proud Brit. I am a proud Frenchman. I'm a proud Irishman. But the other one that he talks about is civic nationalism. And so I would say that really developed within countries that adopted a constitutional monarchy. It's like in England. And so they were very proud of the liberties and rights of Englishmen. And so liberty and freedom became associated with that Anglo-Saxon people group. And so in America, we have, again, kind of a combination of all of that. And so the American identity is a little bit tougher to put our finger on. Let's see here. So that was one of the things that he talked about. And then, of course, the last few pages deal with the dilemma of the Native American. As Americans are moving westward, as we acquire more and more territory, this first big batch of land that's available to Western development was ceded to us in the Treaty of Paris when we won the American Revolution. And the British ceded us all of this land. And so what do we do with this? And so there are 3 theories of thought related to the Indian dilemma or the Indian problem. And Foner sort of compartmentalizes it into 3 categories. He said, some people believe the Indians should move further west outside of the reach of creating problems and us creating problems for them. So keep moving them. Others hope they would just disappear, that the problem of the Indian would just go away, that there wouldn't be any fighting, there wouldn't be any attacks. They just disappeared into the woods, I guess. And then the other, probably more civilized attitude towards the Indians was a hope that as the white men grew and their ways grew and moved into their hunting areas and that sort of thing, that the Indians would finally just agree to civilize, to live like the white man, to come to an understanding of land like the white man did. They call it assimilation. And generally across the world, the British Empire, as they conquered territories and overtook, enlarged the British Empire, that sort of was kind of ground zero. Let's assimilate them. Let's assimilate the native populations, whether it was in Australia with the Aborigines or some of the island groups. The hope was that that they would assimilate into our way of life. And so early on, there was a big press towards they combined assimilation with Christianizing the Indians. If they became Christians, perhaps they would give up their natural way of lifestyle and farm and settle and not kill and that sort of thing. And that wasn't necessarily the case. Just because Indians would convert to Christianity didn't mean that they wanted to give up hunting and living in teepees and or whatever. So they didn't necessarily go hand in hand. And again, it kind of goes back to that, remember that idea that the Native Americans did not look at Earth, Mother Earth, and land the way that white people did. White people coming from Europe, or Europeans coming over to America, who had been prevented from land ownership, which was essentially the way of moving up the ladder. They came to America wanting land because in them that was their provision, that was their safeguard, that was their identity. That is how they increased the benefit to their life and all of those things. And the Indians didn't see it that way, and they never saw it that way. And so it just was a constant problem. So moving farther west, Indians totally disappearing or becoming assimilated or becoming living like the white man. As after the Northwest Ordinance of 1785 and 1787, and with the new Constitution, the understanding was that states would not just transfer land from, take it from Indian tribes and assimilate, take it themselves. Anytime a state was going to acquire Indian land, they were supposed to first get the approval of the federal government, which oftentimes they did not do, which led to conflict and a whole bunch of awful. So states generally ignored that federal regulation, and it did lead to trouble. Let's see. Eric Foner makes the statement that there was no room for Indians who desired to retain their traditional way of life in America's Empire of Liberty. So he is making the observation that the idea of liberty was a very narrow, it was liberty only for the white settlers, that those ideas of liberty and freedom did not naturally bleed over into the native inhabitants of the continent. And so just the irony of that, that freedom and liberty was growing rapidly for the Europeans who had come here, but not so much for actually it was at the expense of Native American territories and also, of course, slaves. Let's see here, and just he also, we'll get into this a little bit more, but Jefferson was a big proponent of assimilation of the Native American tribes. Okay, he just, in a cursory discussion, and this may come out a little bit later when we talk about George Washington's administration in the next chapter, but he talks about some of the conflicts that naturally arose as a result of the settlers moving into Indian territory. And one area in particular was the Northwest Territory. There were a whole host of tribes that lived in that area, lived and hunted in the forest and moved up and down the rivers. And the Ohio Valley, I think it was called the Ohio Company, sent thousands of settlers into those woods. And initially, the various Indian tribes decided to kind of, we can work with this, we can trade with them. But they became alarmed when they just kept coming and kept coming and kept coming. And so they decided to take on a different stance towards the settlers. And in 1790, this was the second year of George Washington's presidency, 1791, the various tribes of the Ohio River Valley, they formed a confederation under the leadership of, I think it's Little Turtle, I think that was his name. Ultimately, the Indians in the area began, especially in a town called Marietta in Cincinnati, which those probably sound familiar to you. There are big cities in Ohio today. The Indians began to kidnap people and to kill land scouts that were just kind of checking out the land, and it got so bad that the people began to move towards the forts that they had developed in their communities, and were afraid to leave the forts. The Indians even went so far as, I don't know why I'm laughing about this, because it's kind of, anyway, in the years leading up to this, the Indians decided they would destroy all of the game in the forest so that the white men could not hunt. They'd have nothing to hunt. So there was almost a time of not quite starvation like in Plymouth and in Jamestown, but there was a period of time where they had very, very little food. People were afraid to send food down the river because of this Indian uprising. And it was a pretty terrifying time. The Indians would sometimes attack homesteaders that were too far removed from the forts and just kill everybody and scalp them and leave them there for dead. And it was an attempt to intimidate more white people from coming. And so finally, the Ohio Company pleaded with George Washington to send backup, which he finally does. It's not that he didn't want to, it's that he was having a hard time getting a militia ready to go out there, and then they were training and dragging their feet. So eventually, after a year of these smaller Indian attacks, George Washington sends an army of about 1,000 up to Ohio Valley to help the settlers there, and they're under the leadership of a guy by the name of St. Clair, who was way too old. He was an American Revolutionary vet, and he could hardly get off and on his horse. He was in no condition to lead this, but for whatever reason, probably because they figured it was owed him, he was given command, and it was an absolute disaster. And so probably the largest slaughter of American life took place, well, at the time, larger than any of the American Revolution battles. The loss of life was more profound in this battle than I think any in the American Revolution. And it was called St. Clair's Defeat. And in this book, I'm reading through this book right now. Can you see that? It's called The Pioneers, and it's written by David McCullough. And he is the same historian that wrote the book John Adams that the HBO series John Adams is based on. And so he's a fantastic author. He writes these stories sort of like novels. So you feel like you're reading a story, not just reading bits and pieces from people's journals and a historian's boring take on it. And so he recounts this St. Clair's defeat in his book based upon the testimony of soldiers and George Washington's letters and things between various officers and eyewitnesses to the account. And when I read it the first time, I just was kind of horrified, I guess you could say. I'm not very knowledgeable about the history of Native American conflict in America, other than what the main stories are told in our history books. You know, there's whole libraries of books told about the conflicts between the Native Americans. And so when I read this, I thought, oh man, I can kind of understand why the white folks were seriously scared of the Indians and why they put their thumb down. Most of them were very uncivilized, and their tactics of warfare were designed to terrorize, to intimidate, and they did. Not to say that the white soldiering didn't do a little bit of that themselves. I mean, the history of European battle and beheading and quartering and disemboweling and all that stuff, I don't understand it. I understand if you got to go to war, but some of that stuff is beyond me. But anyway, I'm going to read some of this account to you. If you are a history nerd like I am and you want to read a good history book, this is really, really good. So I'm going to read just a little bit of excerpt. If we were in class together, I would be reading some of it to you. So anyway, here we go. The following morning, Friday, November 4th, was intensely cold. But as Sargent recorded, the sky was unclouded. The sun was not yet up, and the campfires were blazing in this nestled part of the woods. The troops had already paraded as usual and been dismissed for breakfast when, only minutes after sunrise, the woods to the front on the other side of the Wabash suddenly erupted with the yells of Indians, a sound that most of the soldiers, including Colonel Sargent, had never heard until then. He said, quote, "Not terrible as has been represented," end quote, Sargent thought, quote, "but more resembling an infinitude of horse bells suddenly opening to you than any other sound I could compare it to. All at once, a great number of painted warriors burst from cover and started firing, and almost at once the militia positioned several hundred yards in front, beyond the river, turned and fled. Then Sargent wrote, "Close upon the heels of the flying militia, follow those Indians," who they thought was about 300. The rest of the troops were under arms almost instantly. Smart firing was returned just as fire from the enemy began coming in from all sides. They were surrounded. It was like nothing the army had ever prepared for. Such was the noise and the smoke and the speed of all that was happening, that all sense of order and direction vanished in an instant. The enemy from the front filed off to the right and left and completely surrounded the camp, killed and cut off nearly all the guards, and approached close to the lines, wrote Ebenezer Denny. They advanced from one tree, log, or stump to another, under the cover of smoke of our fire. The artillery and musketry made a tremendous noise, but did little execution. The Indians seemed to brave everything, and when fairly fixed around us, they made no noise other than their fire, which they kept up very constant, and which seldom failed to tell. At one point, they took possession of part of the encampment, but on being exposed on what was comparatively clear ground, they were soon repulsed by troops led by General St. Clair himself, on foot, despite all of his agonies. When the attack came, he had been in camp at bed. He had hurriedly put on his hat, a greatcoat, and tottered out of his tent, with the help of 3 or 4 men. He tried to get on a horse, but the animal, frightened by the gunfire, wouldn't let him. Let's see here. Finally, he was hoisted into the saddle of another horse. The battalions in the rear charged several times, but the attackers, utterly fearless, only turned and fired back. Indeed, they seemed not to fear anything that we did to them, wrote Ebenezer. Atrocities were to be seen on this battlefield everywhere. Wounded men had been scalped while still alive and then flung onto campfires. Dead settler women who had been with the troops were scattered everywhere. Some of their bodies, the women's bodies, were cut in two, their breasts were cut off, and they were thrown into the campfire. "The Indians fought like hellhounds," said another soldier, but then so did a number of the soldiers. When an Indian fell wounded and tried to crawl away, a colonel named Drake took his sword out, rushed after him, and cut his head off. Ohio, with its promise of the Garden of Eden, had suddenly become hell on earth. "I wish I could describe that battle," one rifleman later wrote, "but I have not the power. It seems like a wild, horrid dream in which whites and savages were all mixed together in mad confusion, melting away in smoke, fire, and blood amid groans, shouts, yells, and shrieks. The wounded were taken to the center of the clearing in the woods, where it was thought to be most safe, and where many of those who had quit their post unhurt had crowded together." Let me jump ahead. Let's see here. "As our lines were deserted, the Indians contracted theirs until their shots centered from all points, and now meeting with little opposition, they took more deliberate aim and did great execution." So all the men, all of the white men are in a circle in the middle of this wooded area, and the Indians have full sight on them and are shooting to kill. Exposed as to a crossfire, men and officers were seen falling in every direction. The distress, too, of the wounded made the scene such as can scarcely be conceived. A retreat finally had to be called. The battle had become a one-sided slaughter. A few minutes more and it would be too late. The only hope was that the savages would be so taken up with the plunder of the camp as not to follow them. No preparations could be made. Numbers of brave men must be left, a sacrifice that there was no alternative for. So shortly past 9 o'clock, St. Clair gave the order. In a matter of minutes, the army was in full desperate retreat, a scene of utter panic and chaos. Guns, ammunition, knapsacks were thrown aside, littering the road for miles. A great number of the wounded were left behind, including General Richard Butler, who had been notably harsh with Indians in previous treaty negotiations, and who had often been criticized for knowing so little about the Indians. He was too severely wounded to be moved. Butler was left propped against a tree. He was found by several of the Indian warriors. He was tomahawked, scalped, and reportedly his heart was cut out and divided into pieces to be distributed among the different tribes that fought in the battle. Many more of the wounded left behind, men, women, and children, were massacred and their bodies desecrated. Whew. Okay, I'm going to jump ahead here. Okay, St. Clair's defeat, as the battle came to be known, had been a total disaster. It was worse than any suffered by the American army during the entire Revolution, and the greatest defeat of an army at the hands of natives including Braddock's defeat. According to the count tabulated by Ebenezer Denny, the army lost 623 dead, including 39 officers. In addition, an estimated 200 others, men, women, and children, were killed. In all, only 3 women survived. This made a total of 1,094 dead and wounded, well over half of the 1,400 Americans present at the scene. The Indians lost no more than 21 and 40 wounded. Whew. So anyway, there's some more grisly details, but wow. And so I'm sure when George Washington got word back about this horrible, horrible defeat, it was devastating. They considered bringing up St. Clair on court-martial for dereliction of duty, and how could he, have his men be in a situation where they could be surrounded? How did he not know? So it was a horrible thing to hear from the frontier if you are somebody considering settling in this Western territory that Congress very much wants people to settle. So scary times. There are a couple of pictures here that depict the battle. And my recollection is that Washington sent surveyors back into the area to kind of get a feel for what had happened. And so winter had settled in, and there was just hundreds of dead corpses that had been mutilated, and it was just a really awful scene. So, all right, so moving on. So going back to this whole conflict, the idea that the American Revolution will bring the greatest expansion of liberty to mankind ever. Unfortunately, at the expense of the liberty of other people groups. And what is an American? Does American include the native population, those folks that are black, whether they're free or slave, indentured servants? Who does it include? And then the author, Eric Foner, talks about Letters from an American Farmer, who was written by the book was written by a Frenchman who lived in America for a while and farmed. And his name was Hector St. John de Crevecoeur. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Probably more important than his name is the name of the book, Letters from an American Farmer. And he is the one that first coins the term the melting pot of America. And I have a quote from the book on page 267. It says, one of the era's most widely read books, Letters from an American Farmer, published in France in 1782, strikingly illustrates the process of excluding blacks in particular. He popularized the idea that the U.S. was a melting pot in which individuals from nations around the world joined to make a new man, an American. And of course, he completely excludes blacks from that list. Then he talks a little bit about, so what is a citizen then? So we understand that an American is being defined as those European immigrants that came here and brought their Judeo-Christian value system, but the term American really does exclude the other people being slaves, indentured servitude, probably free and black slaves, and as well Native Americans don't necessarily fall underneath that title as well. In 1790, Congress passed the Naturalization Act to kind of clarify who could become a citizen, and essentially anybody could become a citizen if they were white and they came from Europe. And it says the Naturalization Act of 1790 excluded all non-white people around the world from immigrating to the United States. Eventually that wrong was righted. In 1870, a law was passed allowing Africans to become naturalized citizens, and then Unfortunately for Asians who lived here primarily on the western part in California, working for the railroads and all that sort of thing, people from Asia who came here who were not born here but wanted to become naturalized citizens had to wait till the, let's see here, 1940s. And so there was just a huge push to prevent emigration from Asian countries. And in large part, it was simply that their culture was extremely different than ours. Their religion was very different. They looked very different. They had different customs, different government experiences. And so they were prevented from becoming naturalized citizens till the 1940s. And then lastly, the Native Americans were granted American citizenship if they wanted it in 1924. A lot of them rejected that. And then finally, there's a whole section about Jefferson and his where he landed on the situation or the idea of race. Yeah, I can't say this enough. Thomas Jefferson is a very conflicted fellow. He would say one thing in a letter and then he would contradict it in another letter. He would say he would contribute money to one thing and then secretly bash that in another letter or correspondence or action. So he's really hard to judge. I think his heart was in the right place, but I think he just was very, very conflicted. The author makes the case that he was strongly in favor of assimilation and seemed to feel that the Native Americans had the capability to reason and to enjoy liberty, and might eventually someday be assimilated into American society and become able-bodied people able to enjoy the rights afforded them in the Declaration of Independence, essentially saying they were born with natural rights and the cognitive ability to appreciate them. He kind of went back and forth on Black people. And so part of that might have been the setting in which he lived, and being able to justify enslaving about 600 people. I'll just read some of the things that I made note of. In a letter or something he wrote called Notes on the State of Virginia in 1785. So this would have been, I think he was living in France at the time he wrote this, but he said blacks lacked, partly due to their natural incapacity and partly because of the bitter experience of slavery, had rendered them disloyal to the nation. Would render them disloyal to the nation. In other words, he argued that he didn't know that they had the mental capacity to compete and to understand and to appreciate, although he even said, I don't want to say something that's not true, because if God made them beings like us, who am I to say that they weren't born with natural rights and don't have the mental capacity, the intelligence to appreciate those things and be included in our identity. So he kind of went back and forth. I think you probably read the story about the black man who wrote him. He did some sort of almanac. I can't remember if it was I can't remember. Anyway, it was something related to science and space and math, and it was, obviously something of high intellectual ability, and Jefferson praised him. The man was wanting Jefferson to fight for abolition, and then he, in turn, to another person, wrote a letter saying he suspected that a white person had helped him write it. An astronomical almanac, I think is what it said. So I don't know. I'm a little confused about him. But when he finally did get behind the idea of freedom and abolition, although he continued to hold on to his slaves, he decided that blacks did maintain natural rights and the desire for freedom, and that they should do so in Africa. So he contributed and supported the idea of sending Africans back to their home countries where they came from, where they could live out their days and enjoy their natural rights there, but they weren't truly part of this American identity. So kind of leaves a yucky taste in your mouth that the author of the Declaration would kind of come to that conclusion. And page 269, the author actually says Jefferson reflected the divided mind of his generation. The author does say some good things about George Washington, which I appreciated. And then ultimately he says that Jefferson, when he died, they had to sell off much of his property and his slaves to pay off his debts. So he was not a man that spent his money wisely. And then the author does what most authors do, and he suggests that Thomas Jefferson had a relationship with Sally Hemings and had children with her. I am probably going to assign the chapter in the Jefferson Lies that talks about this lie that Jefferson was the father of these children. It was probably Jefferson's younger brother. Jefferson freed Sally Hemings and her offspring in his will, and so she and her family were freed, probably because they were his brother's offspring. But he's silent on that. So okay, I think that's it. On Wednesday, we'll do the chapter 7 quiz. If you have any questions about this chapter, let me know. I'm going to include some things. On Wednesday, I'm going to give you some of the terms, and make sure you turn in your questions. I think it's 1, 3, and 10 through 16. So there's a lot of questions from this chapter in your period questions. So make sure that you complete those and submit them to Google Classroom by Wednesday. And if you have any questions, I'm probably going to pester you guys. Your class, since your Monday class is from 1 to 1:50, that's when I'm going to make this. I'm going to open this lesson. Some of you have probably already figured out that you can go to YouTube on my channel and watch this before I submit it. But I'm not going to open up the lesson and the adjoining things to it until you can do this one anytime you want to. Actually, I think I'm going to go ahead and just make it available to you, since there's no specific writing prompts or anything today. So anyway, see y'all. Bye.